Happy Easter. That all of us are gathered here today to celebrate the life of a great man. Of all the great men and women who ever lived, he is the greatest by far. And if you think about it, what is happening today speaks to his astounding influence. Thousands of people are taking time today to celebrate his life as part of our community. Millions of people in our country and billions of people around the world will do the same. That we're celebrating the life of a man who grew up in relative obscurity in an impoverished outpost of the Roman Empire. He never wrote a book, never held political office, never commanded an army or headed a company. On the day after Jesus' death, it looked as if whatever small mark he might have made would quickly disappear. His friends and followers fled. His opponents celebrated. The crucifixion looked like the end of the movement he had been stirring up in his little part of the world. But what happened? As Peter said in the passage that we read earlier, Jesus went about doing good. His popularity grew, and it irritated and annoyed the religious and political leaders of Judea. So they conspired with the Roman government to put him to death. Normally, when someone dies, whoever they are, their impact and influence begin inevitably to recede. But Jesus inverted this usual trajectory. Jesus' impact was actually greater after his death than during his life, 100 years later, 1,000 years later, and even 2,000 years later. And his influence is not limited to just his followers. Influence is the capacity or power of a person or persons to be a compelling force, affecting the actions, behavior, opinions, or thinking, and eventually the outcome of others. Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant influence in the history of Western culture for almost 20 centuries. Jesus Christ's influence has swept over history with profound impact and influence on how we live and work. Hospitals and healthcare, childcare, social services, even things as basic as monogamy or democracy have their deep roots in Christianity as Christ followers put their faith into action. While we underestimate Jesus' influence on so many areas, perhaps more than anything else, we underestimate how Jesus influenced the view we have towards one another. Particularly, Jesus changed and influenced the cultural view of children, women, and leadership. How we exercise leadership, how we treat women, how we relate to children. In the ancient world, leadership was all about power and getting to be in control. You assumed power so that you could lord it over others. Position was not for service of the people, but for the leaders in power. While often it's unfortunately still the case that there are plenty of self-serving leaders around, it was Jesus who introduced and modeled the concept of servant leadership. He introduced the idea that those in charge should actually care for the people under their charge and sacrifice for them. At one point he said, "You know that the rulers of this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. No Roman would have been offended by this observation. The whole point of getting ahead and making it to the top was to tell others what to do instead of being told what to do. But what Jesus said next would offend. He said, "Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." He changed how we exercise leadership. He changed how we treat women. That Judaism was unusual and unique in the ancient world in teaching that women as well as men fully bear the image of God. But Jesus put this teaching into practice in a radical way by inviting women into his inner circle to follow him as disciples. And as we heard in the gospel, it was the women who went out to the tomb early in the morning and found that it was empty. Likewise, he completely upended attitudes towards children in ways that today we oftentimes can take for granted. In the ancient world, children were held in no esteem by society at large, except perhaps for the firstborn son. In fact, in poorer families, until they were old enough to work, children were considered a liability. Children were disposable, dependent, defenseless, fragile, and vulnerable. These were not qualities admired in the ancient world. He said in God's kingdom, children are welcome. And then he said something even more astounding that elevated the status of children. He said, "Unless you become like a little child, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." So not only are children welcome in God's kingdom and valued, turns out as adults we have something to learn from them. Most people today don't realize that things we now take for granted that should be made available to every human being, such as education and health care and even a right to life, were reserved for the rich elite in the ancient world. The concept that every person, including women and children, has dignity and should have access to basic human needs and have opportunity to develop themselves and pursue a good life, and that it was the job of those in leadership to ensure those rights. Those concepts simply did not exist in the world before Christ. So how did this all happen? How did Jesus have such an overwhelming impact on human history? Well, while it's true that Jesus never wrote a book or held political office or commanded an army, he did do something entirely original and enduring, which eventually had a worldwide reach. He started a movement. He launched an ecclesia. An ecclesia is a Greek word for a group of people who come together for the betterment of the larger community, with the intention to serve their community. Jesus came to start a movement like that. Ecclesia is translated into English as church. On Good Friday, that movement seemed completely dead, nailed to a cross. But that's not what happened. Something else happened that gave life to Jesus' ecclesia, and as a consequence, to the influence he would have in human history. Jesus' movement was dead and gone, but then he rose from the dead. Peter and others saw it. One account says that over 500 people witnessed Jesus risen from the dead. Some of them ate and drank with Jesus. They hung out and had dinner with him after he had been crucified. We are here today to celebrate the person of Jesus Christ and our belief in his resurrection. Peter says he commissioned us to preach to the people and testify that he is the one appointed by God as judge of the living and the dead. To him all the prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him will receive forgiveness of sins. After Jesus rose from the dead, he commissioned his friends and followers to share what they had seen and heard. He sent them out into the world to share the good news of what had happened. The good news of the resurrection validated all that Jesus taught. So he commissioned his followers to influence the world with his teachings, his thoughts, his power, his way of life. The first Christians were called followers of the way. He commissioned them to dream big, but think little. What is that supposed to mean? Jesus' basic instruction to his friends and followers was go and make disciples of all nations. That's big thinking. He sent them out with a huge dream of bringing everyone into a relationship with him. And that's his charge to us this Easter Sunday. Dream big, but think little. Use your influence right here, right now, to bring people you know into a relationship with him. Use your influence in subtle ways, in small ways, even silent ways. And as more and more people follow Jesus in little ways, big changes can happen in our community, in our city, in our country, and in our world. Jesus has influenced this world more than any other human being who has ever lived, and he invited his followers to influence the world for good. 2,000 years ago, the first followers of Jesus turned the world upside down. Through their humble service of the Savior, they changed the hearts and minds of the pagan world. So over the next few weeks, we're going to learn from the example of those first followers about how to have the same influence in our world. I invite you to join us for this series during the season of Easter as we look to influence others in little ways that can have a big impact. Every Easter Sunday, we return to a very ancient tradition. We renew our baptismal promises to follow Jesus and allow him to influence every area of our life. We profess a desire to live in the freedom we have as God's sons and daughters. It's a way of recommitting, or even committing for the very first time, to a loving relationship with the living Lord. It's a way that we connect to Jesus and his power to live a new kind of life.